O nga hung benzagura pema CD hung. O nga hung benzagura pema CD hung. O nga hung benzagura pema CD hung. Okay, well, welcome everyone to my final talk here at the Buddha Center. Obviously some sort of karmic influence is going on and punctuating my retirement from teaching at the Buddha Center with a general voice failure. So here we are at Dharma by the River, my Dharma Center, where I will be continuing to teach, but not on a regular weekly basis. Given my new circumstances in RL, it's just not possible for me any longer to commit to a weekly schedule. However, I still have a number of talks, largely thematic rather than oriented specifically to specific suttas of the Pali Canon, that I will be compiling over the coming year. And presenting at irregular intervals. I can't really commit to any particular schedule, so I'll simply announce them. I'll probably announce them a few days before, and as I complete the talks. So I have a number of talks that I have planned. Actually, I'll give you the list just so you can see. I'm going to post what I have in the chat. These are the things I'm planning to do over in the coming months. So those are some of the things you can look forward to in the future. I'm sure all of you, most of you are aware, we've been discussing the long suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya as a supplement to my talks on the Digha Nikaya that we completed last June. And I decided to add a supplement of talks where I would consider the talks. I would give talks on the suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya, which are comparable in length to the suttas in the Digha Nikaya. Theoretically, the Digha Nikaya is supposed to be the long discourses. The Majjhima Nikaya is supposed to be the middle-length discourses. But there are discourses in the... Hello, Betty. Thank you for coming. Namaskar. There are discourses in the Majjhima Nikaya which are at least as long or longer than the average length of the discourses in the Digha Nikaya. So purely on the criterion of length, they should be included there, and I've decided to include them in my series of talks. And also the book which I've produced out of those talks, I'll be adding them as a supplement. So today's talk, the concluding talk on the Majjhima Nikaya, is on the Ratthapala Sutta, which is the 82nd sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. It's not a very complex sutta, so it'll probably take me about half an hour to present, and then we'll follow it with just open discussion in chat. Please feel free to ask any questions as they occur to you, rather than waiting till the end. So today's discourse, the discourse with Ratthapala, of course, would be the literal translation of Ratthapala Sutta. However, the Buddha doesn't really have much to say, so in the blog corresponding to this talk, I called it About Ratthapala. Reputedly descended from the quasi-mystical land of Uttarakuru, which we've discussed in previous talks. I'm not going over every single detail. If we've talked about something in the Digha Nikaya talks, I might allude to it, but I'm not going to go into great length about it. And we've discussed Uttarakuru already. The Buddha is wandering with a large number of monastics in Kuru, a country in the northwest area of the 16 Mahajanapadas, the 16 great states of the Buddha's time in northeast India. Kuru, as you will recall, we encountered it in the Digha Nikaya, is a very important region, which was, at the time of the Buddha, already in its decline. However, it had great historical importance. It was the first state in the area, and it's also the location of the Mahabharata, and also a place, city in Kuru is a place where the Brahmins went to discuss the Vedas. So a very significant place for all of these reasons. And the Buddha also visited there. And he arrives at the town. He's wandering, of course, as was his wont. And he arrives at the town of Tulakotita. Ratthapala, described as a young man, belonged to the dominant clan, the only son of a wealthy family, when he formulated the intention to become a monastic. So clearly not all of the monastics were impoverished by any means. The Buddha himself came from wealth, and so did a number of his followers, including Ratthapala. So he visits the Buddha with a group of Brahmin householders. And again, this is interesting because one often finds the Buddha discoursing to Brahmins who took a great interest in the Buddha, despite the fact that the Buddha, theoretically at least, was opposed to Brahmanism and quite often had some rather pejorative things to say about Brahmins. Nonetheless, he was admired by a significant number of Brahmins. In fact, the evidence of the Pali Canon is that the Brahmins really divided into two camps about the Buddha. Some of them, the more traditional-minded ones, were very much opposed to the Buddha. Others, often presented as younger, were quite interested in the Buddha and his teachings. So after the Buddha gives them a Dharma talk, he stays behind, that's Ratthapala, stays behind and asks the Buddha for ordination. The Buddha asks Ratthapala if he has his parents' permission to join the Sangha. This was a rule which we find in the Vinaya, which was instituted by the Buddha in response to the request of his own father, Suddhodana, often but erroneously described as a king, King Suddhodana. Really, he was more of a chieftain. And he had asked the Buddha to institute this rule after the Buddha, I don't recall who it was that the Buddha converted, but it was someone in his family close to Suddhodana who he converted. It may have been, not sure. I don't want to say, I'm not sure. I have a feeling I know who it is, but I'm not sure. So the Suddhodana asked the Buddha not to admit anyone to the Sangha without the parents' permission if the parents were alive. Speaking out of his own concern as a father and a grandfather, he lost his son, and I believe it was his grandson as well that the Buddha converted, and so he lost him as well. And the Buddha agreed to this, and this occurred about the time of Suddhodana's death, which occurred when the Buddha was about 40 years old, about 5 years after his enlightenment. So this gives you a clue as to the dating of the sutta as well. In fact, a lot of suttas have information in them which could be used to date them. This is something I'm interested in exploring further and writing an article about at some point. However, Ratthapala's parents would not give their consent, as he was their only son, and they feared that him having been raised in privilege, they were wealthy, as I said, he would not be able to adjust to the life of a renunciate. But that rather sounds to my ear like a justification for the fact that they simply didn't want to lose their son. Understandable, of course. Ratthapala is so distraught that he lies down on the floor, the bare floor, as the Sutta points out, and declares that he would rather die there than not join the Sangha. This is a motif which one finds repeated in the suttas, and even after the suttas. The great Tibetan adept Padmasambhav also, this is how he became a renunciate. He declared he would commit suicide unless he was permitted by his father to renounce. His parents call on Ratthapala's friends to encourage him to get up and enjoy the householder life, including making merit. This is their argument against joining the Sangha. They argue that he doesn't have to become a monastic. He can simply enjoy the life of a householder, live a moral and ethical life, and use his wealth to benefit others and thus create merit for himself. And this is their response to his wish to become a monastic. The Thai edition of the Pali Canon states that Ratthapala fasted for 7 days. Otherwise, the sutta that we have in the translation of Bodhi, and perhaps earlier, states that Ratthapala is weak when he finally gets up. So this does suggest that a significant period of time had passed. However, Ratthapala would not be prevailed upon. So his friends encourage his parents to allow him to go forth with the argument that they would still be able to see him from time to time, and if he does not enjoy the monastic life, he can still return to them So his parents relent on the condition that he visit them from time to time. Ratthapala goes to the Buddha and informs them, therefore, that he now has his parents' permission. And the Buddha gives him full ordination, somewhat unusual in that the normal practice is for the new convert to become a novice, and then after a period of time to receive full ordination, particularly if the convert is a child. In that case, I think it's pretty much universal. That if he's say 15, I believe that's the Vinaya age for ordination, he would be ordained as a novice, and then when he reaches the full age of ordination at 19 or 20, he would become fully ordained. So later, the Buddha proclaims Ratthapala to be the foremost in those of those gone forth in faith. Subsequently, the Buddha wanders on to Sawati or Shravasti, the capital of Kosala. So he leaves Kuru and enters the kingdom of Kosala, where he has the king is very favorably disposed to the Buddha, Pasenadi, and he stays at Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's park. All of these places should be very familiar to you by now. These are places we've encountered before. Meanwhile, Ratthapala works on himself in seclusion and attains arhatship. So it doesn't seem that Ratthapala follows the Buddha. It seems rather that he goes off on his own and achieves arhatship on his own. Jospe says maybe also a shortcut, like the fasting was mentioned in the Thai Sutra, so maybe he had novice first. Maybe. Maybe when it says he was fully ordained, it simply means that he became fully ordained after being a novice. Who knows? But in any case, the Sutta doesn't mention him being a novice. So Ratthapala works on himself in seclusion and attains arhatship. Interesting, actually, considering that he's the monk, the monastic foremost in faith, declared by the Buddha to be such, and he's so committed to the Buddha, obviously. He doesn't follow the Buddha, but c'est la vie. There's no explanation of that in the Sutta. That's simply what is stated. Bodhi, our translator, notes, Nanamoli and Bodhi, of course. I'm referring to it simply as Bodhi since he was he revised Nanamoli's translation. Bodhi notes that whereas the text says that this occurred before long, a common trope in the Pali Canon, we often find significant monastics achieving arhatship in a fairly short time. The commentary, however, which we can take with a grain of salt perhaps, states that it took 12 years, whereupon he resolves to visit his parents as agreed. This is somewhat surprising if we accept the 12-year figure because he had agreed to visit his parents. The suggestion is that he agreed to visit his parents fairly frequently, certainly more frequently than 12 years, which is perhaps why his father is so angry when he returns, as we're about to see. Bodhi suggests that the 12-year period is believable because his father did not recognize Ratthapala upon his return. We'll see how valid this view is when we get to that part of the story. The Buddha, having given his permission to go visit his parents, Ratthapala returned. So this is 12 years later. So now we're talking, as if we accept the 12 years, then we're talking the Buddha was 40, approximately 40, or later actually. No, he certainly was not younger than 52. If 12 years had passed, and if in fact he had just instituted that rule, it could of course be any time after that as well. So the Buddha gave his permission. Ratthapala returns to Tulakotita, staying in King Moravia's Megachira garden. That's the name of the garden. I'm not sure what Megachira means. I haven't looked it up. Going on alms round, he comes to his father's house. So he doesn't actually go directly to the house of his parents. He goes on alms round, and in the course of doing that, he arrives at his father's house. However, he is not welcome there, since his father blames the Sangha for the loss of his son. And as I said earlier, if we accept the 12-year period, then this may explain why his father is so angry. Clearly, the Buddha was not popular everywhere or with everyone. This is also attested elsewhere in the Pali Canon. It is not quite clear whether this abuse, because the Sutta says, actually I noticed I didn't explain that, but the Sutta says that he was abused at the house of his father. And it's not clear. Jospe says, I had the thought that his father just never had seen his son without hair and beard. That's Bodhi's view. Sort of Bodhi's view. Bodhi's view is that his son was unrecognizable to his father, and that is his argument in favor of the commentarial claim that it was that 12 years had passed. However, if we look closely at the description, maybe that's true, but not necessarily, given the description which I'm about to give. So it's not quite clear whether this abuse was at the hands of his father, who, the text points out, only saw him in the distance, while he was having his hair done, as it happens, in the hall of the central door. But when Ratthapala asks a slave woman to give him some porridge that she was about to throw away, she recognized him. And this Sutta does say that she recognized him, she recognized his voice, his hands, and his feet, which does suggest the possibility that his appearance has changed. However, the other side of that is that his father only saw him in the distance, which means he may have just seen a monk in the distance. At a distance, he might not have recognized his son. And the slave woman may not have known him that well or remembered his face. So it's maybe 12 years had passed and his appearance had changed. Maybe they didn't recognize him because he had shaved his hair and beard. Or maybe it was a short time, as the Sutta says. It's not quite as cut and dried as Bodhi suggests, I don't think. In any case, it's not a very important point. We do know from other suttas that arahants did, or monastics did attain arahantship after fairly short periods of time. So we don't really need this sutta to explain anything doctrinally, so it doesn't really have a great deal of doctrinal significance either way. Even 7 days should be possible, that is correct. It states, the Buddha does state that, assuming, of course, that we don't regard this as a typical exaggeration, which the Pali Canon does indulge in, but the Pali Canon does explicitly have the Buddha stating that it is possible to attain arahantship in as short a period of time as 7 days. So that could also be the brief time that's referred to. Although perhaps it does seem surprising if it was only 7 days that they wouldn't have recognized him. She told this to Ratthapala's mother, or that's right, the slave woman, told Ratthapala's mother, obviously still alive, that her son was in the vicinity. And the mother was so, whose name we don't learn, was so happy that she freed the slave woman from her bondage out of gratitude. And she in turn tells Ratthapala's father. Meanwhile, Ratthapala is eating the porridge beside a shelter in the vicinity, showing that monastics, also the thing that interests me about this is that it shows that, first of all, that the monastics did not always travel in groups. We think of the monastics going on alms round as doing so in groups, and then taking the food that they gather back to the abode, trying to think of the Pali word, vihara, where they live, and sharing with the rest. However, this clearly shows that monastics also did travel around by themselves and seek alms for themselves and as well, in addition to living in groups. So that's an interesting detail. And even asked for alms in certain circumstances. If you've read the Sutta, you'll recall that Ratthapala actually takes the initiative and goes to the slave woman, seeing her throwing the porridge into the garbage, essentially. He asks for it, which is somewhat also interesting because there are Vinaya rules which suggest that the monastics are not supposed to actually ask for food. They simply gather, go from house to house and stand there quietly and make themselves available to be offered food, but they're not actually supposed to ask for food according to the Vinaya, I believe. Of course, we don't know also at what stage of the development of the Vinaya this Sutta was. In any case, in this case, he did ask for the porridge for himself, and he was traveling alone. Ratthapala's father goes to him. Contrary to Bodhi's assertion, he seems to have no problem recognizing him, but rather once he goes up to him, there's no suggestion that he doesn't recognize him, but he's overcome by emotion. He actually, according to the Sutta, he actually stutters and is unable to complete a sentence. He's so overcome by the emotion of seeing his son, and he invites him to eat the porridge in his own house. Ratthapala, however, refuses, declaring that his meal for the day is done, so presumably he was in the act of completing his consumption of the porridge when his father came to him, but he agrees to come the next day for his daily meal. Ratthapala's father then hatches a plan and calls upon Ratthapala's wives, or I suppose ex-wives. I guess still technically they're wives. I don't know the legality of if you become a monastic, are your wives still wives or not under ancient Indian rules? It's an interesting legal question. I don't know the answer to that. Nonetheless, he had multiple wives, and Ratthapala's father instructed them to attire themselves in their finery. He also makes a large heap of gold coins and bullion, and according to Bodhi's translation, he covers it with mats, a rather strange image. The Thai edition says that the money is concealed by a screen rather than by a mat. I haven't looked at the original Pali word. Again, it doesn't matter that much, but that's the fact of it. Finally, he prepares a meal of good food of various kinds. This is during the previous night. Next morning, he calls upon Ratthapala to come. So obviously Ratthapala is in the vicinity. When Ratthapala comes, his father offers him the gold, which he says is his maternal, paternal, and ancestral fortunes, and entreats him to return to the home life, the householder life. Ratthapala, however, advises his father to dump the gold in the Ganges, since it will bring him nothing but suffering. He's unmovable. He's an arhat, of course, at this point, and therefore, by definition, unmovable. His wives then ask Ratthapala what the nymphs are like, for whose sake the monastics lead the life of renunciation. And this is probably the most interesting point in the Sutta from our point of view. And it's not the first time that we've encountered a reference to monastics developing the spiritual life for the sake of the nymphs, higher dimensional beings, deva beings, possibly in the realm of the four great kings. It's an interesting question. I'm not exactly sure which deva world these nymphs are supposed to be inhabiting, but we have encountered this motif before in the Pali Canon. And this is a theme that comes up elsewhere, as I said, where the Buddha and specifically in the other example of this that I'm thinking of, the Buddha seduces a householder into the monastic life with the promise that he will encounter nymphs more beautiful than any woman, presumably reflecting a view of the time concerning deva women. These are females of higher spiritual beings, which was perhaps the goal of some samanas. It's a strange motif, certainly not part of the Buddhist path, but possibly there were samanas at that time who were cultivating the spiritual life for the sake of encountering, if you like, we can imagine what that might imply, these extremely beautiful deva women. And of course we find this motif interestingly in Islam, where the Islamic heaven is specifically and explicitly stated to be populated by beautiful women with whom the follower of Allah has relations. And this is a part of the Islamic doctrine, as you will see if you listen to some of the people who are seeking to be born in the Islamic heaven, the followers of Allah. So this is obviously a universal motif that transcends Buddhism. But Ratthapala tells them that this is not the goal of the Buddhist monastics. And in fact, in the other story that I'm thinking of, where the Buddha seduces, quote-unquote seduces, not literally seduces, but gets a householder to join the Sangha with this promise, he subsequently admits that this was just a ruse. And in fact, this is just a ruse to get him to join the Sangha. Ratthapala refers to his wives as sisters, and they faint away from shock or surprise that he is referring to them in this way. Ratthapala becomes impatient and asks his father to stop harassing him, but to give him his daily meal, the daily meal that he promised him. So Ratthapala isn't very friendly to his father, according to the Sutta. Nevertheless, his father serves him the food with his own hands. So in a way, the tables have turned, because initially we're not that impressed by the father. Now the father seems to be the more impressive figure. And to a modern reader, and of course this is obviously not how the redactors of the Pali Canon saw it, but to a modern reader, Ratthapala might come across as quite stern and abrupt, even rude, in his attitude to his family. And this attitude to the family and this emphasis on the renunciation, the rejection of familial relations, also comes up elsewhere in the Pali Canon. There's a story somewhere in the Pali Canon where another monastic who has left his wife and who has abandoned his wife and his child, and his wife comes to him sometime after he's become a monastic and entreats him to come back to her to help her raise this child, and she brings the child with her to prevail upon the monastic. I forget who it was. I forget his name, and he ignores them. He sits there stoic, indifferent, absolutely indifferent to their entreaties. And finally she leaves with the child, and he's not moved at all. I think literally he doesn't even speak to them. And this all too is presented by the redactors of the Pali Canon as showing the commitment of the monastic to the monastic path, and as being something praiseworthy. Of course, we, with our modern consciousness, would tend to judge this in our own fashion, but clearly, from the perspective of the redactors of the Pali Canon, this was a notable and worthy thing that he and now Ratthapala did. That they were cold and indifferent to their families. Jesus too says that Yeshua says that one should renounce one's family. After reading, Ratthapala spontaneously composes and recites a poem in which he compares his wives to puppets, describing their bodies as sick, filthy, and covered with sores and skeletons in fine attire, and that the only thing that makes them attractive is the clothing, that underneath they're vile and repugnant. Since the skin is an excretory organ, this description is literally correct. He concludes the poem, "The deer hunter set out the snare, but the deer did not spring the trap. We ate the bait and now depart, leaving the hunters to lament." Whereupon he returns to King Kauravya's Magachira garden in the vicinity to spend the day in meditation at the foot of a tree, So this is an interesting detail that shows us what the monks actually were doing during the day. Pretty much the morning time was the time of activity for the monastics. They would get up early. Sometimes they would visit together with each other, meet together to discuss Dharma, and then when it became a little bit later, they would go into the local town or village to collect their alms, bring them back if they're living in groups, obviously, bring them back to share. And by noon, the monastics were not allowed to leave the vihara. They would spend the afternoon. They would take a nap sometimes. The Buddha in particular is described sometimes as having a nap in the early afternoon, and then they would spend the rest of the day in meditation, meeting together again in the evening to either discuss Dharma or listen to the Buddha's teachings on Dharma. So he returns to King Kauravya's Magachira garden to spend the day in meditation at the foot of a tree, a popular location for monastics to meditate, and of course also the place where the Buddha himself was enlightened, where he is seen by the king's gamekeeper. The king's gamekeeper is actually tidying up the garden in preparation for the arrival of the king, who at that time didn't know that the Buddha was there, didn't know that anyone was there, and he was tidying up the park or the garden for the king, who was going to go there just for an outing. And the gamekeeper sees Ratthapala beneath the tree, and he tells the king. Ratthapala had a good reputation with the king. He admired his family, and he admired Ratthapala for his strength of his commitment to the monastic path and being willing to walk away from so much wealth and privilege and become a monastic. So the king goes to pay his respects along with his most eminent officials, his entourage. He also brings an elephant rug for Ratthapala to sit on. I don't know if this is an elephant and a rug made from an elephant, or a rug that has pictures of an elephant on it. I did do a little Google search to see if there is such a thing as an elephant rug made from an elephant. I couldn't find a picture of a rug made from an elephant on Google Image. It doesn't mean there was no such thing. So either it was a rug with pictures of an elephant on it, or it was a rug made from an elephant. But he disdains to do so. Or a rug to put on an elephant, who knows? I don't know what elephant rug really means. One would have to do some very good research to find that out, and might not even be able to find out. But Ratthapala once again disdains the offer and refuses the rug. So Ratthapala is very straight-minded. The king observes that there are 4 reasons why many people undertake the monastic life, including aging, sickness, the loss of wealth, and the loss of relatives. But it seems that Ratthapala has not experienced any of these kinds of loss. Therefore, the king asks Ratthapala why he has undertaken the monastic life. Ratthapala's response is interesting because it constitutes a 4-fold summary of the Dharma, and therefore presents us with yet another way of seeing, in a kind of synthetic way, seeing the teachings of the Buddha. So, the principles that he cites are recognizable to us as students of the Dharma, but at the same time they're also a little bit different, and for that reason they're interesting. So the 4 principles are: 1, life in any world is unstable. It is swept away. 2, life in any world has no shelter and no protector. 3, life in any world has nothing of its own. One has to leave all and pass on. And finally, 4, life in any world is incomplete, insatiate, the slave of craving. Note Ratthapala's rejection of any world. The goal of Buddhism, as we've seen before, is not rebirth in a higher world or a mythical heaven, but rather the transcendence of the whole world system of samsara altogether. And these sorts of minute correspondences, where we find very minute details in different suttas that correlate with each other and support a consistent and synthetic worldview, are some of the reasons why we have such faith in at least the 4 great Nikayas, that they do present, even though they are obviously edited and compiled and developed over a period of centuries, that underneath all of that there is a consistent worldview that we can presume essentially corresponds to the teachings of the Buddha. The first principle relates to the doctrine of impermanence or change, one of the three characteristics of the world. The other two, of course, being non-self-identity, anatta, and suffering, dukkha. The second principle refers to the, Jospe says, so one does not follow the path for any nymph in what world soever. Not if one is seeking ultimate emancipation. Now, the Buddha does present multiple paths in his teachings, including the aspiration to be with nymphs. He describes different intermediate goals for those who don't feel able or ready or don't want to pursue the highest task, which is absolute emancipation. The Buddha does talk about sexuality in the context of Deva worlds. There's a famous story of a married couple who were very much in love, an older married couple. I think the impression one certainly gets is that they were older in any case, but they'd lived together a long time anyway, and therefore must be older by definition. They approached I can't remember their names. They both begin with N, Ratthapala or something like Nattamita, something like that. I can't remember exactly. Nana Mala and Nana Mita, something like that. And they approached the Buddha, and to cut the story short, they say to him, we love each other. We want to be reborn again together. Is this possible? And the Buddha doesn't say, go away and pursue ultimate emancipation, you deluded people. What you're proposing is preposterous and disgraceful. He says that he admires true love. Essentially, he opposes arranged marriage and believes in marriage based on love. He says to them that they can do this, that they can achieve this and be reborn together, and he tells them how to do it. Now that's not quite the same thing, but one presumes that this concept of aspiring to a Deva world in order to have concourse, let's say, put pleasantly like that, concourse with nymphs, this is such a unique and idiosyncratic notion that I'm sure it must come from somewhere in Indian tradition at that time. He also teaches people how to achieve union with Brahma, quote unquote, and be reborn in the Brahma worlds, or how to be, just in general, how to be reborn in Deva worlds. So he doesn't reject the concept of being reborn in a Deva world as a spiritual objective. He simply says that this is not the ultimate spiritual objective. So it's important to realize that. The Buddha was not a prude, and he was not a sectarian. And if people asked him how to do things, he would tell them, even if it didn't correspond to the ultimate project of emancipation, which is, of course, essential and ultimate teaching. The first principle relates to the doctrine of impermanence or change, one of the three characteristics of the world. The second principle refers to the absence of any redemptive principle, whether a god or otherwise. The world cannot be transformed into something else whereby one is reborn in a perfect heaven. So this immediately rejects all of the Semitic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, for all of which being reborn, quote unquote, being reborn in heaven is the highest task. The Buddha rejects this absolutely as the highest task, but he certainly doesn't deny that you can be reborn in a higher world. Therefore, the Christians will be reborn. One can infer, therefore, that the Christians will be reborn in a Deva world corresponding to their conception of heaven. The Muslims will be reborn in a Deva world corresponding to their conception of heaven, and the Jews will be reborn in whatever world they believe in. Because all of these worlds are ultimately the creation of the mind. However, he does reject that any of these rebirths are permanent or perfectly blissful. You will always fall back into greater suffering. Joe says, and bodhisattvas can vow to keep returning for the sake of emancipation of others. Yes, and you can, this theme, this is a theme we tend to think of in the context of Tibetan Buddhism, this notion that one can influence one's rebirth, consciously and intentionally. I was actually surprised when I started studying the Pali Canon, because like most people, I've been programmed to believe that the Pali Canon is sort of this pristine original teaching that the later traditions have nothing in common with. This is a fabrication, a complete fabrication. And actually, if you look at the texts carefully, you will see that these principles are there in the original suttas. And this notion that one can influence one's rebirth and intentionally be reborn in certain circumstances is absolutely canonical in terms of the Pali Canon. And Argus Portal says, return or rather not go through that door? Not quite sure what you're asking me there. Betty says, I'm sorry, everyone. RL needs me. I'll try to be back ASAP. Okay. If you think it's only going to be a minute or two, Betty, we're happy to wait. Or has she left already? Looks like she's gone already. Okay. So Argus Portal, can you clarify that question? I don't quite understand. Oh, you have already. If they achieve the goal, there should be no return. Yes, there's no return from ultimate emancipation. That is correct. And even that, there's a little bit of wiggle room, because the conventional notion is that once you let's speak of the Buddha. Once you achieve Buddhahood, once the Buddha achieves the ultimate goal, yes, a bodhisattva has not achieved the goal. That is correct. A bodhisattva is almost. He's on, and not even necessarily. You can be a bodhisattva. Anyone can be a bodhisattva simply by vowing to be a bodhisattva. So there's a great range of attainment of bodhisattvas. But the highest attainment of bodhisattvahood is like a hair beneath nirvana, but isn't quite nirvana, because you are correct. Although I'm about to explain a little wrinkle, there's a wrinkle there, but you are correct in saying that the conventional view is that once you achieve Buddhahood, there is no rebirth. However, even Buddha cannot return. That's the point I want to address. That is the conventional view. That is the conventional interpretation of the Pali Canon, that a Buddha cannot return. But technically, if you read the texts very carefully, what they actually say, and this becomes significant in the context of Tibetan Buddhism, what they actually say is that a Buddha is not subject to involuntary rebirth, that there is no basis for involuntary rebirth. And certainly in the Theravadan view, the Tathagata does not return. And the Buddhist does say that. He says, as a Tathagata, I will not be seen again. I will not return. But if you want to parse the words very carefully, what they actually say is that there is no involuntary rebirth. That doesn't mean that a Buddha cannot, in certain interpretations, that does not mean that a Buddha cannot re-manifest. It's called a Buddha emanation. And this concept of a Buddha emanation appears at first sight to contradict the idea of that once you attain Buddhahood, there is no rebirth. But really, the doctrine is that there is no involuntary rebirth. He is not compelled to be reborn. That does not mean that he cannot be reborn. He has complete control over his own. He's transcended karma. So, I want, and this would be the other side of the argument. The argument would be that he has transcended karma, that there is no karmic basis for him to be reborn, and therefore he cannot be reborn. Not only is he not subject to involuntary rebirth, he cannot be reborn because he has no karmic basis in which to be reborn. But that does not mean necessarily that he cannot manifest himself or interact in some way with samsara in a manner that transcends involuntary rebirth. And this is a point of contention between the schools. Some schools hold that the Buddha can manifest in the world, and others hold that he cannot. So the Pali Canon, of course, also says, as I said, that the Tathagata the Buddha says the Tathagata will not be seen again, which even then does not necessarily mean that he cannot manifest or influence or interact with samsara. It simply means that if he does do so, he will not be recognized as such. So this is a sectarian point which I don't have an opinion on one way or the other, but the literal meaning of the text is that a Buddha is not subject to involuntary rebirth. And beyond that, it's a matter of opinion. Rollo says, I'm just going back through the... So Argus Porter says, even a Buddha cannot return. Judge Jospe says, indeed. Argus Porter says, with that I have big problems. I'm not, again, ambiguous antecedent. I'm not sure what that is referring to. But certainly Theravadins do not believe that the Tathagata is reborn. Argus Portal says, once the goal is achieved, there cannot be any control of anything. That's my idea of all of this. Maybe. I mean, that's certainly a legitimate view. I'm not saying that's not a legitimate view. The other side of that, the argument on the other side of that would be that having achieved, the Buddha does not disappear. The Buddha rejected nihilism. The mind stream continues eternally. This is, the Dalai Lama says, this is the view of most Buddhist schools, and it also is my view. I think this is implied throughout the Pali Canon. The Buddha refers over and over again to the deathless, which means immortality. The mind stream continues forever. So there is a being. There is an individual being who transcends rebirth and continues. Now, whether that being the argument against the notion that the Buddha cannot manifest again in samsara, in some sense, is that having mastered this whole system, therefore, the system is subject to him, and whatever his will is, that is what will occur. So if he wishes to manifest in samsara again, then he has the capacity to do that. Now, the question then becomes, would a Buddha will that or not? And that's an open question that different schools have different views. The Tibetan Buddhists tend to believe that Buddhas do interact with the world. They can be prayed to, they can manifest themselves in the world as they wish, that they have complete power over that process. Others do not hold that view. So I have no strong view either way in terms of the texts themselves. I have no proof or argument either way. Rollo says, thanks, Tseten, that makes sense, linking rebirth with karma with concept of samsara. Thank you. Josospe, ideas are conceptual. It might block your right view. Yes. Josospe, I think it's ultimate control when one achieves the goal. Yes. Argus Portal, Jos, not to have ideas is what? I'll leave that to you two to discuss, because I think that's beginning to get into or we can discuss it afterwards. Argus Portal says, you think, Jos, that could block your mind? Okay, I'm thinking this is something that we might like to discuss afterwards, because there's certainly a lot that we can discuss about it. So I'm not going to address any of those points at this time. I'm going to finish off the talk, and then if you want to talk about it in chat, we can certainly do that, because it's a very interesting point. And I don't have, if I had a canonical argument in favor of one or the other view, I would make it. All I can point out is what the words mean and various alternative interpretations. I personally don't have a strong view either way. So, getting back to the talk. The first principle refers to the doctrine of impermanence or change, one of the three characteristics of the world. I'm just going to recap a little bit. The second principle refers to the absence of any redemptive principle, whether a god or otherwise. I think I've explained that. Rather, one's karma is one's own and must be borne by oneself alone. There is no vicarious atonement, as in Christianity. There is no divine intervention, as in Judaism or Islam. So Buddhism rejects all of the whole Abrahamic tradition in this respect. The third principle refers to the ubiquity of death, which is really another aspect of impermanence. At death, everything is abandoned. There is no continuity of property or possessions. The fourth principle, there's however a continuity of, there's the mind stream continuity of essential consciousness, not of memory, not totally. Some memory survives. But there is an essential continuity, and certainly karma. There is a continuity of karma. So that's why in some of my writings I've talked about, in the context of discussing the mind stream, I've talked about the individual karmic continuity. The fourth principle refers to craving, which means that one is never satisfied and always seeking more than one has in a vicious round, vicious since everything is impermanent, and that leads us to inevitably to unhappiness, as we in early 21st century world are seeing very clearly playing itself out around us, which I think probably is one of the major reasons why so many people are becoming interested in Buddhism. Finally, Ratthapala reasserts what I have repeatedly called attention to in this series of talks, the centrality of wisdom as the essential salvific principle. Quote, "Better is wisdom here than any wealth, since by wisdom one gains the final goal." By wisdom one gains the final goal, which is the fundamental premise, of course, of the Prajnaparamita, which became the ground, if you like, the foundation of the Mahayana tradition in the 1st century before the Common Era, about the same time that the Pali Canon was committed to writing. And I'll repeat that again because it bears repeating. By wisdom, one gains the final goal. Not by Vinaya, not by rules, not by ethics, not by doctrinal affiliations or sectarian affiliations or anything else. It is by wisdom that one attains the final goal. Finally, he reiterates that karma follows one from life to life, what I called the individual karmic continuity, perpetuating suffering. Okay, I thought that was going to be a short talk. It turned out to be the better part of an hour. This does complete my series of talks here at the Buddha Center. Welcome to Dharma by the River, where I will be continuing my talks, but not on a regular weekly schedule. That's the basic problem with the Buddha Center. I can't maintain a weekly schedule anymore since my RL circumstances have changed, and also the nature of the talks. Now that we've finished this series of talks on the Digha Nikaya, of which these talks in the Majjhima Nikaya were really just a supplement or an extension, I plan to continue my study of the Pali Canon for at least 3 more years. I want to start getting into talks where I draw upon multiple sources and present talks relating to topics rather than talks relating to specific suttas. In order to do this, I need more time to prepare the talks. So they won't be weekly. They may be once every month. Probably at least once every 2 months. I'll be giving at least a 1-hour talk, and possibly some of these will be 2-hour talks. And I have a number, including my much discussed talk on UFOs and the Buddhist tradition, which I'm also very eager to present. So this does complete the series of talks that I'm planning to give to the Buddha Center, and I will announce talks in the future that I'll be presenting here at Dharma by the River as they become available. Now, before we finish off with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, followed by our informal Dharma chat in local chat, does anyone have any further questions, comments, or discussion of this sutta before we finish off with the dedication of merit, excluding the point about involuntary rebirth, which I suggest we discuss in local chat afterwards if people are interested in continuing to discuss that. Any questions, comment, or discussion? And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to get the dedication of merit. Okay, I'll just give you 30 seconds or so. Do you have any final questions, comments, or discussion? And then we'll conclude with dedication of merit. Right, note card. I always forget to mention the note cards. I haven't put it on note card yet. It is on the blog now. And I will be putting on a note card after we finish. So if you would like a copy, just IM me, and I'll be happy to send it to you. But give me a little time to do that because it's not on, I haven't actually copied and pasted it yet. Okay, 30 seconds is up. No one said anything, so let's conclude with dedication of merit. And those of you who wish to hang around and just engage in local chat, and it's sort of a celebration too, because this is the end of my Buddha Center period, which I've been doing for at least last 2 years. And there's tea in the corner. So there we go. There's the dedication of merit. Let's do that. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity over the past few years to present Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege as always. And we'll be just continuing here at Dharma by the River in the future in a new format. Namaskar.